Hi, and welcome to this on-demand webinar from Search Laboratory. Today we're looking at technical SEO and specifically for international sites. I'm John, I'm the VP of Sales for Search Laboratory based in New York, covering the US. A little on my background, I've been in digital marketing and SEO specifically for well over a decade now, both in agencies and also working directly with clients in-house. But much of my time in my career has been spent on looking at the internationalization of digital marketing, so working on cross-border international multilingual sites. So I thought today I'm going to talk you through and share with you some of the most common issues that clients have faced and hopefully how you too can resolve them. Now, international SEO, the technical side of it, is really the firm foundation that we need to make sure that any other hard work that comes off of that in terms of outreach or content creation all goes on a solid platform, and that we're serving the right content to the right users, and that Google can get a really clear understanding of what content is destined for who. So today we're going to look at site structuring first of all, so some of the different ways you can put your website together, some of the pros and cons of each approach, and also look in detail at some of the domain strategies that you can use. We're going to look at hreflang tag, really important part. It's probably the biggest area that we work on in terms of people not quite getting it right, and it has a really big effect in terms of Google's comprehension of what you're doing on your site for international audiences. We're going to look at some of the functionality that exists within the Search Console and how that can help with your international planning. And then also we're just going to look at some of the more common mistakes that we've found and how you too can avoid falling into some of those traps. So a little bit about some of the clients that we work with here at Search Laboratory. We work with clients across a whole range of different industries, B2B and as well as B2C, and we work with most of these clients across multiple markets. So one of these clients, for example, we work with them across 7 different markets to help them with their SEO, helping them with content and outreach, as well as making sure that the technical foundation is really solid. We also work with another one of these B2B clients up here in terms of helping them with their paid search across 10 different markets, making sure that the full experience is fully localized, authentic, and they're not missing any opportunities by going down a replicated or translated route. In terms of what makes us different, Search Laboratory as an agency, well, our clients typically work with us because of our international reach. We've been international in nature from day one, and we founded the agency in 2005, so we've been doing it quite a long time. And we have an in-house team of international experts to make sure that all of our campaigns are fully authentic and fully localized, and that provides a really big difference in terms of how we can affect cross-border marketing. We also have a really scientific approach, so hence the name, Search Laboratory, with really deep technical expertise and a really evidence-based approach to make sure that everything that we put into practice has been thoroughly tested and researched before we recommend it. In terms of our services, well, we offer a wide range of services across digital, all of which has a very evidence-based approach to strategy, so a really deep strategic insight before we actually begin any of these activities, all underpinned with a very detailed analytics and data science team. And then what runs across all of our services is our ability to actually execute these across international markets. So again, using that international team to really make sure that what we're doing is authentic and culturally sensitive and really engages the people in the markets that we're looking to target, not just a replicated version of a US strategy. We've been around since 2005, as I mentioned, and we're really proud that we've been now recognized by the industry for the good work that we've been doing, both in the UK and in the US. So enough about us, into the agenda, and we're going to start by looking at site structure and domain strategy. And we get asked about this a lot, and to save any future unnecessary migrations, it's well worth considering all of the options well in advance, particularly when talking about a domain strategy. So in terms of structuring a website, there are 3 main approaches that you can take. Firstly, there's a CCTLD, so a country-coded top-level domain. So example.fr for France, example.de for Germany. The next option is a subfolder approach, so having one master domain.com and then using subfolders /US/FR/DE to structure how the different language content or the different international content can sit within the site. And then finally, we look at the subdomains. So We have here us.example.com, fr.example.com. So don't worry too much about the content on this slide. Really what we wanted to talk about was the fact that actually there are a number of different attributes that each of these options have for you. Each approach has its own pros and cons, and one will be more suitable for specific sites and specific markets than the other. We're going to look at this in a bit more detail now. If you want to get a copy of this particular slide, then just send me an email. My details are at the end of this, or you can get in touch with us via the website, and we'll happily send this on to you so you can look at it in a bit more detail at your leisure. But firstly, we're going to look at the CCTLD. A brand that uses this to good effect is Coca-Cola. You can see the different extensions there for each of the markets. And the biggest advantage of this approach is by far the fact that it has a really strong location signal, and this offers it to search engines. So having a .co.uk site, for example, is a very clear signal, it's a definite signal to Google that that content is to target people in the UK, as would be .fr for France or .de for Germany. This will almost certainly give you a ranking boost over sites that don't take this approach, and it also increases the level of trust amongst your audience, and it can result in a better click-through rate, for example. We know just from experience and from research that we've undertaken with clients in the past that users in France, just for one example, are notoriously swayed by a .fr domain, and they're far more likely to click on that than a generic top-level domain such as a .com. In terms of drawbacks, there are increased promotional efforts for each site. Because they're set up and hosted separately, there's no sharing of link authority or from any parent top-level domain. So in essence, you're going to have to build up the link authority from these sites from scratch, which can make it much harder to rank, requires a lot more resource and time. And then it's a smaller disadvantage, but you've also got to consider the cost of buying each domain and setting it up and maintaining it. It can be quite time-consuming. If you're a major brand, you might also have the difficulty of purchasing your domain from someone else. So it's possible that someone else already owns that CCTLD for your brand, and they've potentially done that to try and hold you to ransom effectively. There are ways of you legitimately going through and actually obtaining that if you're the rightful owner, but it's really time-consuming and it's potentially a hassle that you really don't want to take. So next we're going to look at subfolders, and Apple does this with great effect. The main benefit of this is really that you can share all of your link authority of the top level domain. So any links built across all of the country sites will effectively benefit each of the other subsequent sites. This can have a real ranking benefit and is really, really scalable from that point of view. So, if you have a new regional site, actually getting that site up to a level of authority can be relatively quick, even if they're relatively new. The secondary benefit is the lower setup and maintenance costs compared to the CCTLD. What holds this approach back is that it really has a lower trust element compared to the CCTLD. Especially in certain markets and certain industries, you may not necessarily see as strong a click-through rate that you would do if you took a CCTLD approach. And then finally, there is a much weaker location signal to search engines compared to that CCTLD. In fact, from the three different approaches that we're going to talk through, it's definitely got the weakest location signal. But there are things you can do in Search Console to improve this, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. I think the big takeaway from this is if you are planning to go into a number of markets, then this provides by far the most scalable structure. Finally, we're going to look at subdomains. This is used by Wikipedia, and this approach sort of sits in between the two in terms of pros and cons. It doesn't really have the full benefits of either, but it doesn't necessarily have some of the restrictive drawbacks that the others offer too. So firstly, there is a degree of location signal given to search engines. Because you can host separate subdomains in separate countries, that could give you a rankings boost. There's also the lower purchase and maintenance costs, and you can set up all subdomains to your heart's content without having to buy the new CCTLDs. And then finally, there is some sharing of authority between the domain, but certainly not as much as you'd expect to see with the previous subfolder approach. This leads us on to drawbacks. There is still some increased promotional and linking activity required because, as I say, you won't benefit from all that link authority of the TLD. And the location signal offered by the server location is nowhere near as strong as you would get from a CCTLD. So we've gone through at pace how you might want to set up your site, and I suppose something else to consider is the content that you're going to host on those sites. So you're likely to come up against two certain situations. So firstly, multiple same or similar language content targeting different locations. So in the example here, we've got 4 pages of English content targeting these 4 different countries. The next scenario is where you've got fully translated content for different languages. So here we've got 4 pages of content in English, French, Italian, and Spanish. And adopting either of these approaches is going to give you potential issues with regard to SEO. So there is a way that we can give search engines much more information about our content so that it ranks correctly every time. The solution to most geo-targeting issues is the hreflang tag. I'd probably say this is one of the areas that we get asked to advise on the most. It's relatively simple. However, we frequently see small errors in setup and implementation, and getting it wrong can have really big implications for international content serving. So we're going to run you through the main things that you need to know about the hreflang. So hreflang is a HTML tag that you can add directly to the source code of a page, and it indicates search engines the language of the content and also whether or not there are any alternate versions for other languages or specific locations. So that's effectively what it does. Its main purpose is to help search engines understand the language of a piece of content and therefore make sure that it serves it to the correct users in the correct market. There's 2 main ways in which we can use this, and then when you've got duplicated content in one language targeting a number of locations. So for example, you might have small variations in pricing, currency, delivery options, etc., but the content is still in English, for example. And then the other way of using it is if you've got fully translated or localized content for different languages. Even if you've got that, it might look different on the page because it's in a different language, but you still need to use hreflang code to give Google as much information as you can to make sure that the right content is served to the right people in the right location. So just to visualize these 2 scenarios, here's the first. We've got 4 versions of our widgets page, and they're all set up to target users in different countries. So these are 4 different pages with the intention of serving information on widgets to people in the US, Ireland, Australia, and the UK. Problem is they're all in English, and so Google is met with complete confusion because it doesn't know which of these it should be ranking in which market for the keyword widgets. And it's likely to react to this. One of the scenarios is it will just pick one of these and rank it in all markets, which is definitely not what we want, because you might have those small variations in currency or price or some of the terminology or usage being served to the people in the wrong markets. A more extreme reaction might be that it doesn't rank any of our content and instead gives preference to our competitors, so it just doesn't understand, gives up, chooses a completely different site altogether. So that's definitely not what we want. So in this scenario, we can use the hreflang. We can use the following hreflang code to make sure this doesn't happen and that Google understands the setup of our content correctly. So we're going to show you how this code breaks down in a bit more detail. First of all, we tell Google that there are alternate versions of this piece of content. And then we give them the location of these alternate versions, and we tell them the language of the content. And then finally, we say which country location these are relevant for. Now, really important here, it's always language, then country. One thing to say about this code is that hreflang's primary function is to indicate the language of a piece of content. So this part of the code is always necessary. And then specifying a country, that's kind of optional, but obviously in this case it was needed because all of our content was in English anyway. And then Google gets a really clear idea, confusion's gone, likes us again, and they've got enough information to rank all of that content to the right people. So the second situation I gave was translated content in multiple languages. So we've got another simple example here. We've got 4 pages, all targeting the keyword widgets, or a localized version. I don't know what the French, Spanish, and Italian word is for widgets, but each piece of content, Google still doesn't have enough information to rank the content correctly, especially if, for example, we've hosted all of this on a generic .com domain. So we've got exactly the same setup here, but we're specifying the different languages. So we can use a hreflang code to give Google the information it needs. So here we're clearly stating the language in which each piece of content is written. So for English, French, Spanish users. And then we can be even more specific by adding a country identifier as well. But as mentioned before, this isn't always necessary. So now Google has all of the information it needs on how to rank the content accordingly for each of these markets and each of the languages. Another way to use hreflang is for any piece of content that doesn't specifically target one particular language or country. And this is called the xdefault tag. So a really common use would be on a country selector page, for example, or any other kind of catch-all content. It's really to identify that there is content for languages that aren't satisfied by one of the other alternate versions. So say, for example, you had a visitor from a far-flung Pacific island who you don't have a particular site for. You'd want to land them on the country selector page or a generic homepage so they can then navigate the way to the experience that best suits their needs. And we can put in this xdefault tag on the most relevant page for those. So, Google now recognizes that this is the page that you should show users who don't meet the other criteria that you've already told it about. So I think this kind of wraps up a really quick look at hreflang, but it really does show you how to implement it at a page level and hopefully, how to structure that piece of code. What we're now going to do is look at implementing the code for much larger enterprise scale websites. And this is probably where we need to have a look at using things within the XML sitemap. So sitemap implementation is a far easier way for people with large sites or enterprise scale sites to manage hreflang. It requires the addition of certain modules into a standard XML sitemap. So this is what a standard XML sitemap looks like, and just have a look at the middle line where it says loc. It shows the location of the URL on the website to make it far easier for websites to crawl. The next piece of code, which looks more complicated, is an expanded XML sitemap, which contains references to all of the hreflang tags that we've got in there. A lot of these elements look the same, such as the language we're speaking in and the location of the URL. But then this section that's just highlighted by the bracket is the addition. And you'll recognize the same tags as before, so all of the elements are identical, but they're implemented in a different way. So we always recommend having a self-referencing hreflang tag in there as well. And this is there to make it much easier for Google to build a picture of how the website is structured, and it also helps with the implementation and management itself. So in terms of looking at Google Search Console setup, we will always recommend using the hreflang tag to send a strong signal on the intended international audience. But we can also help Google understand which content is for who by some of the settings in the Search Console. So within the interface, we can set up a profile and target your site to users in a specific region, and all of the options are already in there. And just remember that a ccTLD will auto-detect the target country, but the rest of this targeting can be done at a domain level or a subdomain level or a subfolder level. If you want to target multiple countries which have the same language, you can select unlisted. So if, for example, you want to target French content for both France and Canada, you can do that using the unlisted option here. So this is just another way in which you can send a signal to Google that, yes, I have multiple pieces of content, but they're in different languages or they have a different audience profile. So that's much of the implementation on hreflang, on its uses and its implementation. But when I begin working with clients, we often find that there are some relatively easy to fix issues that we find, and we're going to share some of these with you now. So as I said, these aren't huge tech changes, but getting it right and resolving those issues has made some massive improvements to our clients' international performance. So I want to talk through some of those common mistakes that we regularly come across and how you can avoid them. So firstly, not implementing hreflang at a page level. So this is the first mistake. Here's an example of hreflang implemented on the home page on all websites. And then here's an example of page 1 HTML, and you'll notice that the middle part of the code has changed. This is important because this is the code needs to accurately reflect the exact alternative, and accurately show exactly where it resides. The next thing we're going to look at is problems with targeting whole regions, and this is actually surprisingly common, particularly when we're looking at Europe, and we're going to use Europe as an example here, but equally we've also seen the same issues with Latin America, APAC and EMEA, so treating an entire region in the same way can cause problems. One of the biggest problems that we find is actually to do with ISO naming conventions. So the international standards organizations, they have these naming conventions for looking at a particular market. So EU, for example, is not recognized, and therefore we can't target it with hreflang. But we can use hreflang en or an hreflang xdefault. You might find that it might gather some non-EU traffic, so I'd recommend staying away from this kind of structure. But there are ways to manage it. It does, if you are insistent on targeting an entire region with a single site or a single page, there are ways to manage it, but it does take a lot more work in comparison to managing country websites. So what I'd suggest is, if you're struggling with this, get in touch and we can have a conversation with myself and some of the technical team. We can talk you through some of the other options. But it's just something to be aware of for now, that this is a common error that comes up. Another common error is missing return links. And we see this time and time again. Again, it's quite a quick fix, but it's worth getting it right. So if a piece of content references another piece of content within the same hreflang code, the second piece of content basically needs to refer back to it. It's as simple as that. So if we have a US homepage referencing French, Spanish, and Italians, a bad example would be the French site not referencing back to the US site. So you'll notice that the EN US reference is missing in this second incorrect piece of code. That needs to go in there to ensure that the hreflang code is valid. So there it is. So otherwise, Google won't build a full picture of all the content on the website. And the best and easiest way of managing this hreflang code is to copy the same code for the page and copy it to every appropriate alternate page. So the top batch will be copied to the French homepage, the Spanish homepage, the Italian homepage, etc. And this means that code is always going to be self-referencing. Just important to mention that you only need to reference when an alternative page exists. So for example, if there is no Italian homepage, we don't need to link to it. It's pointless. This is mostly applicable to sort of catalog style companies where products might not be available in every country. And in that case, just simply remove the page from the hreflang code. Not as common, but we do see it happening a lot, which is people specifying the country and not the language. Basically, it just won't work. So the hreflang is primarily a language tag and not a country code. So for example, someone might put the hreflang code as US or GB, which is not a valid code, and it wouldn't be recognized by Google. In that case, in this scenario, they would need to use EN-US or EN-GB. However, there are some codes which are the same, such as FR, ES, IT. What you need to do is have a look for the list of ISO country codes and make sure that you're actually getting this right. You can find that list on Wikipedia, for example. Again, feel free to get in touch and I'll send you the right link of the ones that the guys in our team use. You don't need to memorize them all, just have a trusted resource that you can use. And next, away from hreflang tag, it's one of our pet hates actually from an SEO perspective. It is IP redirection. So it's one of those common issues that we see kind of away from hreflang tag. Basically, it can be seen as a really good thing from a usability perspective, but there are instances where this can be really damaging to SEO and it can be really irrelevant for the user. So we've tried to visualize this here. But in this use case, an American user accesses the UK English page, and we detect the IP address and we redirect that user to the American English page because they're searching from the US. However, if I was a British user in America, I want to access the British version of the content, and I may just be in the US on holiday or working away, and actually I don't have a single choice about the content that I want to view because I'm automatically forced by IP detection to view irrelevant content. So from a UX perspective, that's where that can easily fall down. But from an SEO perspective, this is really the biggest problem, is that Google is in America. And so based on the IP address, it would keep redirecting Googlebot to the US site, despite us wanting the bot to crawl the UK content. And exactly the same thing is going to happen for Spain, Italy, France, or in fact any other country other than the US. So we strongly recommend that people stay away from this. Typically better to use a well-structured website, hreflang, and geo-targeting, just to make sure that users receive the right content from the SERPs rather than forcing them down a particular route once they've already clicked through. So the next issue is kind of variation on a theme, but this is dynamic serving of content based on a location, so a cookie or an IP address or login details. So in this scenario, this is typically served on a single URL. But in this scenario, if we had an Italian user trying to access our US content, the server would realize that the user is from Italy and then automatically change the content dynamically to show in Italian. So an example of this would be some of the very basic translation proxies that are out there that would automatically detect a user's IP or a cookie and then would change the content on the same static URL to display in Italian language, because the assumption is that that user would want to read the content in Italian. The problem here is that there's no unique URL for the Italian content, which means that Google won't rank for any Italian content, and therefore there will be no visibility in Italy for Italian users. So this does have its uses. So if, for example, you're paying for traffic and you want to land Italian users from your paid ads onto a site that has a better experience, then that was going to happen. But just be really honest with yourself and bear in mind that you will never rank organically for any Italian terms. And I think I would also add as a note of caution, just beware that the quality of any automatically translated content in this way is probably not going to be to the standard that you would want, and certainly not to the standard that you should be exposing your customers to. And ultimately, that's going to provide a poor, potentially brand damaging experience anyway. So if you've got the capability to get translated content for a region, I think just strongly recommend you structure the website accordingly and get the maximum coverage and visibility for your website, and invest in good localization. I think one of the pieces of advice that we often talk to clients about is, rather than going out into a really large number of international markets quickly, you're better off investing the right time and effort and doing a smaller number of markets well, and make sure that the experience is correct and that you can actually begin to build up some organic visibility in each of those markets. So that kind of brings us to the end of some of those more common pitfalls. I hope that's been useful for you. So in summary, duplicate content for different countries, if that's a problem that you've got. So multiple markets with the same language content, then use the hreflang tag. If you've got translated content for different countries, again, use the hreflang tag. Just on the first point, I think it's also worth bearing in mind, and I'm experiencing this for myself, we can often be countries separated by similar language. So it's sometimes worth considering what the difference is in search demand and whether or not you actually need localized content for a UK and US audience or for an Irish and Australian audience. In terms of tapping into the motivations and the exact vocabulary that people are using to search for things, it may not be that it's English everywhere, and certainly the same will be true in between Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, for example. So really get into the detail of that. Moving on to the third point across the top there, so please avoid a redirection for dynamic content or dynamic content based on location. This can severely restrict Google's crawl. That's one element of it. The other is that it can often provide a really poor user experience as well. And then finally, make sure that your content can be found through internal linking, and then use the Google Search Console for more geo-targeting options as well. I hope that's been useful. My contact details are on the screen. If you want to see any of the other details in there, or you want to ask any questions, then feel free to get in touch. You can get in touch with me by email, by phone in the US office, or via the website. I hope that's been useful, and I look forward to speaking to you all soon. All the best. Bye bye.